Major concern is the inability of manually coded English systems to accurately represent spoken English. Now, didn't I just tell you about that? And I told you there was probably 10 studies now that show that it does. And notice, you know how research is written? You say something and then you back it up by all the research. You notice how there's no research backing that up there? A major concern, and then it ends, let's see, there's an inability to accurately represent spoken English in a manual form, and then right there, there's no references. And there could be about 10 references to show that that's not correct. High rates of production errors have been documented in studies of teachers using manually coded English. Okay, and then they list these research studies. These are all PSE studies. There's not one, you don't see Liedtke-Stallman in that list, do you? There's no study in there that represents a C1 or a C2 study. And then here's the Marmo and Petito study that I told you about. And like I said, very few people know that that's based on 2 teachers who use Pigeon Signed English. So this one right here, Johnson, Liddell, and Erding, isn't even a study. It's the Unlocking Curriculum paper, so it's not even a research paper. It's not research. It's a summary of research that's been done. Well, you have to kind of consider the times, and you know, in a way, you have to consider where we kind of were with signed research at the time, and it was a nice attempt to at least get a handle on what was happening, but it's just been misused. I mean, all studies improve with time. We get more sophisticated, and so I don't fault their efforts, the Marmo and Petito efforts. It's just their work has just been misused, and instead people don't discuss the number of studies that are now available to show that you can sign. And in fact, one of the highlights of my life was sitting in the audience one time when Sam Sapala was talking, was lecturing, and he said, we probably now have enough research to show that you can sign English on your hands. And I thought I'd die and go to heaven, you know, because it was such an historically wonderful thing to say. Because for years before that, there was whole groups of people that said that what we've been studying all week was not possible. It just wasn't English. And there's a very famous paper that Don Moore's delivered where he is at a conference and he holds up written English, and he says, would you all agree this is English? And all these deaf people on this panel say, yeah, it is. And then he says, well, this has just as many fallacies as signing in English. It's not a perfect representation of what we say, but it's English, and that's how. And then someone says to him, well, would you say that English on your hands is English? And he says, of course. And that sort of ended it right there. From that time on, he's the editor of the American Annals of the Deaf as well as the senior researcher at Gallaudet University. And from that time on, it was kind of like a dead issue. Okay, so this overhead is going to be a little bit hard to read, but it's, again, if you wanted a copy or something of it later, I would be happy to provide you with it. This handout is set up in terms of grammar and meaning, and it's just a number of studies that show that you can do these things. A high sign-to-voice ratio is possible, and here's a number of different studies that have shown that, and that meaning can be signed accurately, and there's that 1988 study that I discussed earlier. Consistency in use is associated with high English skills, and there's a couple studies there that have shown us that there's a positive relationship between the mother's use of affix markers. Affix markers are all those prefixes and suffixes that we study here, like un and mint and nis. Okay, those are affix markers. And this is saying, this study that was done in 1976 shows that if mothers use those with their deaf children, they would use them back. And then I replicated that research with teachers and interpreters, and showed that the same thing was true for students that had access to them. They were using them. This affects issue is another one that's just been really batted around the field a lot, and you'll see that come up a little later. But this is also the idea of English in, English out. And there's a lot of people, when I first started working in deaf education, there were some people down here that some of the supervisors will recognize, like Marianne Mormon and Pam Fight, that I'd lecture on the stuff, they'd go back, they'd try it out, they'd come to the next meeting and they would say, oh, guess what, we used, you know, ment and ness, and the kids were giving it back to us like 2 days later. And they really got excited about how this was working. And a lot of the people in Austin as well. The deaf students exposed to grammar-based models of signing, in other words, CCC input, read better. And there's been some of my work as well as Schickenmoller, and I'll talk about that a little later to show that. The deaf students exposed to CCC input have better English skills. I mean, doesn't this just sound like, duh, no kidding? I mean, it's so simplistic that you just wonder why we have to struggle so hard and why we are so offensive to so many people. And I know this has probably happened to most of you as well, but I have walked into a meeting of my professional peers called ACED. It's ACEDHH. It's the people that are professors in deaf education, with Gerald Lee, and nobody would talk to us for a week. I mean, this is really traumatic for a lot of people, and I just don't understand it. I have no stock in Modern Sign Press. When I started this work, I wasn't a parent of deaf children. I was just a researcher, a university professor. And I started to see that there was a lot of logic in using a complete grammatical form. I mean, you have no other language situation where people talk Pidgin signed English, you know, what we used to call, I can't think what we used to call it now. But, you know, people used to talk how they'd sign, gloss. They'd talk, sign gloss, like, you want bathroom now, you? You know, there is no language model. Oh, you're not guilty of that, are you? There's no language model for that at all. When people say to me, well, you wouldn't sign those grammatical endings to an infant or a toddler, would you? I say, well, what do you say to your young children? Do you, like, take off the ing markers when you talk to your babies? I mean, no, you just, I get a little excited when I...
Push that button. No, on the light.
This?
Yeah, that's supposed to be up there.
All the way up? Oh, okay. It's really a shame. It's really embarrassing how poor my AV skills are for somebody in deaf ed, I'll tell you. Okay, so anyway, then there's a number of, so this could go, I could go on and on with this, but then there's a number of studies that have shown that there's many omissions made in signing that is based on meaning. Okay, what's that? That's signed English and Pidgin signed English, or Pidgin signed English by whatever you want to call it. And there are a number of studies that have shown that, but they're all studies that have used signed English or Pidgin signed English. Probably not many of you have seen this book. This is a new book by David Stewart, who's a deaf teacher trainer in Michigan, and myself, and it's called The Signing Family, and it's a book for parents who are trying to decide if they want to sign and how they want to sign. And it is a book in which no sign system is slammed. It's set up in terms of what are your goals, and this sign system might better help you achieve those goals, and here's a sign system that might help you achieve these goals. And in a lot of ways, I mean, I'm very, very proud of this book, and particularly because I think it's the first time that I've been able to express a lot of the things that I express in workshops, but in a written form, so that there'll be more people that will be able to read about this. And I just want to read you, this will probably kill off the interpreter here, but I just want to read you slowly a little bit of what I'm talking about. In a section called C as a Model for English, there's a paragraph that says, critics say that C is not a natural language. And this comes up all the time. Well, you can't use C because it's not a natural language. We concur in the same sense that we agree that print is not a natural language. But is C English? It certainly is. A more relevant question for parents would be, is it possible for an invented sign system like C to represent English effectively for deaf children? And can deaf children use C as a base for learning to read and write English? Obviously, the developers think so, and studies have shown that some deaf children learn the complexities of English and learn to read well when they are exposed to it. The fact that C has enjoyed some degree of success in the field is enough to recommend it to parents. One mother told us that she wasn't bothered by the fact that C was invented because she seems to be able to do anything with C that can be done with spoken English or ASL. As she puts it, I can use it to comment, describe, and explain things to my deaf children. I can use it to read to them, complain, and pray. They use it too, and I'm satisfied with how well they're learning English. One of her daughters has the same level of English skills as her hearing peers, and the other daughter is only a year behind in English and reading. And it goes on like that. And, you know, it's a chance to kind of take all these common things that are said about C or invented sign systems, but especially C, and have a counter argument to them. And, you know, again, sometimes it just takes common sense. When people say to me, well, you know, you sign in a sign system, I say, well, yeah, I do. And they, you know, well, it's not natural. Well, no, it's not. But I can tell my kids anything. I mean, what does it really, I'm not a linguist. I don't care that it was invented. I care that it allows me to communicate about very common as well as very abstract things. And that, again, usually just stops people cold. If you don't get real defensive and you just think about the real practicality of what we're learning how to do this week, there really isn't much that people can criticize that really makes a difference. Okay, well, I'd like to talk about a few more studies in this handout. On page 5, there's a study that I did in 1989 that was called Can C Children Understand ASL? Now again, this is one of the biggest issues that comes up. This is the only study that I know of where people have systematically looked at whether C children can understand children that ASL using adults. I was in Omaha at the time, and the public schools there use C, and the residential school is right in town, and the children there were ASL using children. So at the time, there was a program called, I forget, something Rainbow, and Rainbow's End, thank you, Rainbow's End, and it had all these wonderful deaf adults on there telling ASL stories. So I took little clips of them off, and I showed them to both groups of children, and I analyzed whether they were how they were able to comprehend those stories and found no difference. Now, it isn't that the methodology of the study was real great, and it certainly could be something that we could have some master student replicate for us because it's been, you know, 10 years since this research was done. But at least there is something to say to people, well, I know of a research study that shows that deaf children don't have any problem understanding ASL, or C2 children don't have any problem understanding adults who use ASL. I also, in my own experience as a parent, can say that as well, but so can everybody. You know, everybody can bring out their stories. We need to base what we talk about on research, and that's how my program is set up, my teacher training program. That's how my books are written, and I think that's what makes people interested in my textbooks and my workshops and my research is they know that it is based on research. Our field has been based on people's personal opinion for just too long, and we need to use a research-based support. Also on page 7 is, I think, an important study by Mary Pat Moeller that was done with a colleague of hers named Debbie Johnson, who has since gotten married, and I don't know her new name. This is a study that was never published, but it was presented at the ASHA, American Speech and Hearing Association conference. And what they did is they showed 10 years of data from Sedalia, Missouri, which was at that time, and I believe still is, a very strong C2 program. So the study documented 10 years of reading and English language ability of students who were 7 to 18. Subjects were from Sedalia Public School. Results were that as the children got older, their English complexity got older. A second finding was that they topped off on the test of syntactic ability, which is a very common test used to look at the syntax, the grammar, the form of English with deaf children. By the time they were 14, they couldn't give them that test anymore because they were just scoring like 100% on that test. And that their consistency of bound morphemes, which is another way of saying those affix markers, those prefixes and suffixes, were observed in conversation. Their speech ability in general was low, and 9 out of 12 of the subjects read at or above grade level. So this was a really good piece of work to show that C2 was really working for these children. Now later, and this is described in a Schick and Mulder paper on page 8, a lot of those same children, as well as the Omaha children, and Omaha has had a C2 public school program for many years, were used as subjects in a study by Brenda Schick, who is a hearing child of deaf parents. She's a linguist in our field, and Mary Pat Moeller, who I think you all know. I love this woman. I named my child after her. What can I say? And when you hear them each talk about this study, it's very interesting. Brenda has really focused on how the fact that in this newer study, the children didn't use a lot of the affix markers as a way of calling what they're doing a pigeon. And I think it's very confusing because it's not the kind of a pigeon that we think of when we think of contact language or case. But again, it's this issue of whether these kids really use these affix markers that we sign in their own language. Mary Pat, when she presents on this paper, talks more about some of the other results, which were things like the results were that the subjects had age-appropriate syntactic or grammar and vocabulary skills. They had age-appropriate skills. Their performance on standardized tests, which were not normed on deaf children, revealed that the subjects read within normal limits. And then there was variability in their ability to use the inflectional morphemic affix markers, that part that Brenda talks about. A really important thing about this study was that it came out right during the big bye-bye enthusiastic movement. And it showed, it was the first study that we could really use to show that ASL was not the first language of all deaf children. I mean, these people clearly documented that these kids had been raised on C. Their English was very complex, age-appropriate, they read well, and ASL was not their first language.